In this video, we'll be looking at arrays. More specifically, how do you load and print the contents to an array? Now, before we get started, an array can be both a data structure and a control structure. An array is a data structure because it is a way of organizing data. For example, we know with simple data structures such as strings that they only store one type of data. So for example, we might have a string called name. We only store one name called Peter, for example. With an array of strings, we can store more than one type of string, which is contained in a data structure called an array. Now, arrays can be all the data types that you can think of. They can be, for the purpose of Software Design Development Year 11, they can be an array of strings, they can be an array of integers, an array of reals or floating points, an array of decimals or booleans. They also can be a control structure. The reason for this is that we can process, search, sort, add values to arrays, which means that we can structure them in a way to be able to do, as I said. Today, we'll be looking at how an array can be used as a control structure. So the example I've got here is we have an array of 5 animals: cat, dog, pig, fish, and cow. So instead of having 5 separate simple data types or strings, we can store them under one array. Now, the reason why this is really powerful is one, it will save space, but second and most important is that we can process this array. By process, we mean adding, deleting, and printing the values inside the array. Now, there are 2 elements inside the array, or 2 areas inside the array we should be aware of. The first is called the index, and the index basically is the location inside the array. Most indexes will start counting from 0. However, you can start counting, or you can start the index of an array at any point. You'll see in some textbooks they use 1. If you were to decrement and go through an array, you could start it from the end of the array also, but we're looking at that in future tutorials. The second part of an array is called the element. The element is the actual data that's being stored at the index value. So you can see here that we have 5 index values, and at index 2 we have the animal pig. So it's really important that you understand the relationship between the index and the element. So if you scroll down, there are 3 different ways that you can process or have control structures for arrays. The first is called a counted for loop, and you can also use pre and post test loops. In the next video, I will go through examples of pre and post test loops. However, to keep it simple, we'll look at the simple counted for loop. How this looks in pseudocode is that we have a let the count equal 0 or set the count equal 0. It's really important that we write down what state we're going to set the count to, or in this case, this is the count is the index. The reason for this is we need to know where it's counting from. So you can see an example, we'll be counting from 0 and going all the way through to 4. Then we have a simple for loop here, which you can see goes through. So let me explain how this works. First one here is got the element or the array name called animal. You can call this whatever you want. Do make sure that you keep it something that makes sense. Then in the brackets, we are referring to the element location. So at the very beginning, this count will be 0. What happens is inside this loop, we can do what we want to in terms of processing it. So this one here will print the contents. So because the first count is 0, it's going to print cat. Then what happens is it gets the next count, which is 1. Then it will go to dog. Then it will go next pig, next count fish, and then finally the next count will be cow. So this is a simple structure. It looks like a loop inside a flowchart. However, I do recommend that you get comfortable looking at pseudocode examples of arrays, because that's pretty much what we're going to be using mostly in future exams. So let's look at an example. So if you download the attached worksheet, which is included within inside this video, you can see the first example says, write a program that allows the user to input and print 10 animal names. Use the following as a basis. So for here, we are using our index for I. You'll see in lots of examples and on the internet, they use the word I. It's because it's short for index. It's just easier to remember. However, you can call this count you can call it index, you can call it whatever you want. However, I is a common way of referring to an index. We set to 0. Then we have a for loop. The first thing we're going to do here is animal I, so animal will be 0, 2, and you can write this in several ways. You could say to the end of the array, or you could say to the physical length. Now, there's no real right or wrong way of writing to the end of the array, and it's really whatever the exam states, but as long as it makes sense. You could write animal, you could write that, or you could also write end of elements, or end of I. It really comes down to what you're comfortable with. Now, it does say in this example here that we want to input the animal, so we're referring it to its abstract content of I. The reason for that is that as we're looping through this, it depends on what the count is up to. So don't hard code it and put 1. Leave it as I, and then we want to print it. So we're going to do the same thing, print animal, and then I. And then finally, we have next I. So what will happen here is this first one will be 0, and then we're going to enter in the first animal 0, and that could be like, say, pig, and then it's going to print pig. Then it'll go next I. We'll go to 1, and then inside 1 we might put on a horse. Then I'll go next I, or 2. Next up, we put in the next animal, which could be sheep, and so on. And it keeps going through until it gets to 4, which is our 5th element. And then when it loops through next time, it can no longer go any further because we can't go any further than the end of the array. It breaks. And then we have inputted our 5 animals and we've printed the contents. So remember that I is an abstract term and just refers to wherever the index is inside the array. Now, arrays take some work to getting used to. It's okay to find them a little bit of a struggle at first. However, I do recommend that you complete the next 2 questions. And if you're still stuck, please let me know if you've got any questions.